So I've been working on a video about seasons 1 through 3 of The Boys, but season 4 of Halo Infinite dropped a couple weeks ago and got me thinking. Rest assured, I will still be releasing the video about The Boys, but it's going to be one that I think would really benefit from some added planning and scripting. So I'm glad that my favorite video game franchise gave me something to talk about in the meantime. The title of Season 4 is Infection, and it brings with it the Infection game mode that fans have been asking for since the game released 18 months ago. Infection as a game mode has been a fan favorite ever since its arrival in Halo 3, and its incredible adaptation and expansion in Halo Reach. However, unlike every previous iteration of the mode, Halo Infinite's version sees you battling other Spartans that are infected and controlled by an enemy AI, rather than some type of biological threat. At first, I thought that was a pretty cool and unique detail, but then my fairly critical brain started to think about the execution of the seasonal narrative and whether or not my praise was truly warranted. That led me to identify a couple risks video games run when their stories are tied to everything in their game. I am your host, Jacob. Let's talk about 2 pitfalls of assigning lore to every aspect of a video game, even if it is pretty good. When 343 Industries took over the franchise, they made a big push to canonize a bunch of things that were of either dubious canonicity or things that you just wouldn't think about. Ever since Halo 2, multiplayer maps have had little lore descriptions added to them. As such, you could always assume that they were real locations in the Halo universe, but that the battles that happened there were not. However, Halo 4 renamed its multiplayer component to War Games, and all the multiplayer battles became simulations that take place on the UNSC Infinity's combat deck. That means that you, the player, are canonically a Spartan 4 when you are playing in the multiplayer match simulation in Halo 4, 5, or Infinite. Admittedly, that idea is pretty cool, and I think it is one of the things I liked best about Halo 4. I'm not defending the gameplay of Halo 4, as while I don't hate it, I do find myself feeling like I'm playing Call of Duty with energy shields instead of a true Halo game. What I will defend though is the idea that multiplayer could be considered a canon tool in the lore. They even canonized the multiplayer announcer as being part of the War Games and changed the fan favorite Infection mode into a new variation known as the Flood. And this is where our first pitfall comes in. Creating, or specifically not creating, gameplay mechanics for lore reasons. To elaborate on this though, I'm going to have to do something we do not normally do, and break down the multiplayer gameplay a little bit.
Stay in your lane, bro.
I know this channel normally just focuses on the stories of any video game it may cover, but I promise it matters to where we are going. Infection as a game mode made its debut in Halo 3. Players started out with a shotgun and a pistol and did their best to survive other players who were infected. If a survivor got killed, they respawned as an infected and tried to kill the remaining survivors. Halo Reach expanded on this by allowing infected to have armor abilities, mainly sprint and evasion, but the added speed was balanced by the pistol having a scope and a higher rate of fire than that of Halo 3's. Halo Reach's infection mode was certainly the high point for me personally. Headshots were the name of the game, and survivors could rack up huge kill counts, but ultimately the infected would normally get everyone. To me, it was perfectly balanced, and I cannot ever remember feeling like there was an infection game I just didn't enjoy. Halo 4 changed that. Because it wanted to present a game mode rooted in lore, infected players no longer look like other Spartans with different paint colors. Instead, they look like what 343 envisioned a Spartan would be if they were ever infected by the Flood parasite. That's not the part I disagree with, though. The part I and many others hated was the gameplay itself. Because along with the skin changes, infected players also had energy shields. So rather than being able to hit them in the head once for an instant kill, you first had to hit them 3 times with the pistol in order to take their shields down, and then go for the headshot. This was much more difficult thanks to the pistol having a high bloom rate to simulate weapon recoil, and the Flood players being much faster to simulate what would happen if a Spartan 4 was ever infected by the Flood parasite. Not being able to get one-shot kills really took away from the overall experience, and it became a lot harder to defend yourself if you were a survivor since the shotgun became your one and only means of doing it properly. To be fair, the shotgun was incredibly powerful. Its effective range was pretty broken if you were going up against a single infected player. But if you were ever going up against more than one infected, you would get overpowered more often than not because the rate of fire on the shotgun was not fast enough to handle multiple targets in its effective range if they attacked simultaneously. In Reach, if you were a good shot with a pistol, you could theoretically defend yourself from an entire horde with a single clip by achieving headshots. Or you could snipe them from greater distances before they ever got to you. In Halo 4, your only viable option was the shotgun, and you would inevitably lose as soon as you ran out of ammo, or too many of your fellow survivors became infected. It just didn't balance well. To give 343 credit, a lot of this was fixed in Halo 5 when they did away with the Flood game mode and brought back a revamped version of Infection. But it was a defining failure for Halo 4's multiplayer, and one that still stirs negative emotions in me almost 11 years later. While Flood and other aspects of the Halo 4 multiplayer are examples of what can go wrong when you let lore make gameplay decisions for you, the design of the Master Chief's armor in the campaign is an example of what goes wrong when you retroactively assign lore to an art design or story detail. Halo 4's art design was a dramatic step away from the series' previous style. Among other things, Master Chief's armor got a complete makeover between games. But if Chief has been locked in a cryotube adrift in space the entire time, how did his armor configuration and titanium alloy plating get completely reshaped? Well, luckily, we don't have to think of an answer ourselves, because developers came out and said that Cortana was able to mold his armor thanks to advanced nanobots that the Spartan armor would have in case of damage.
Nanomachine, son.
See, now that's some bullshit.
On paper, that is a completely legitimate answer. We are talking about a franchise that takes place hundreds of years in the future, and advanced nanobot technology could have theoretically been developed to do that. The problem is that that answer falls apart if you think about it for more than 30 seconds. In Halo 3, Chief's chest plating was damaged during the opening cutscene and was never repaired. In Halo 4, that same gash remains. You can see it in the opening cutscene of the mission Requiem, and also at any point in the mission Dawn if you are playing in co-op. So if Cortana was able to use nanobots to completely reconfigure the suit while Chief was asleep, why couldn't she repair this gash? The answer is, of course, because the artists did not know that their design decisions were going to have to be represented by lore until after the game released. But if you are looking for a story-accurate answer that doesn't cause a lot of plot holes, I can actually think of one.
Chicks dig scars.
Now this issue in particular might seem like a real nitpicky problem to many of you, and that is a totally fair opinion to have. But when you make the decision to base everything you can around lore, or apply lore to details where none existed, you open yourself up to this type of criticism. If asked why Chief's armor looks different, because video games, would normally have been a completely acceptable answer. I think the fandom would have found it satisfactory for the developers to have said that there was no story reason for it, and they just really wanted a different look for the Mark 6 armor. But because they chose to surround every design and development decision with story, and they retroactively applied lore to fix internal miscommunications with their artists, 343 did not have that option. They felt like they had to provide something, and that something caused issues after release. To be fair to 343, I think they fell into these pitfalls out of a genuine desire to give players an immersive experience. While 343 has earned many criticisms over the years for their choices, rarely is it because they don't care about the franchise or its fans. Or at least until recently, that is. Frequently, they make mistakes and learn from them the next time around. Halo 5's multiplayer does not cling nearly as tightly to the rule of lore accuracy. There were some things they added like Breakout and Warzone, but many other game modes that could be considered just for fun, like Sumo or Halo 5's version of Infection. While there are certainly game modes and maps that could be considered non-canon if so desired, there are other things that firmly proclaim to be in-universe wargame simulations. On the more nebulous side of this are the seasonal fracture events. This is where you get skin items like the Yordai, Eagle Strike, and Chimera armor cores, which are described as armor sets from alternative timelines in the Halo universe. Ultimately, these events offer some fan fiction level of writing and are not meant to be taken too seriously. But then we get to the seasonal narrative. The seasonal narrative is marketed as a continuation of Halo Infinite's story, based around characters and events occurring off of Zeta Halo. As a short recap, Season 1 just introduced us to Spartan Commander Agrina, and the recruit she is training at a yet undisclosed facility. Season 2 showed a 2-person Spartan team returning to this facility with one of the Spartans bringing a banished AI in his neural link. This introduced a Battle Royale mode that ran for a couple weeks during Season 2. It was described that Spartans fighting in these simulations irritated the AI and would help extract it out of Spartan Din's head for some reason. The cinematics for the beginning of Season 3 shows Din recovering in Iritus, trying to learn something about Din's past, and the facility they are staged in. And by the way, I know it's pronounced Iritus in the cinematics for some reason, but I absolutely refuse to refer to it as such. It's Iritus. We all know it. The suffix comes from Latin, which, you know, Tartarus from Halo 2 had it. Brutus, Commodus, all of these things are real words that pronounce it correctly. So I don't know why they call it Iritus. It's Iritus. It even plays better. It sounds better. So that's what I'm referring to it for this video. The end of Season 3 gives us a second cinematic confirming that the training facility we are in was an old Spartan 3 facility and that Iritus has infected its network. And that's it. 4 cutscenes with mediocre writing spaced out over 18 months, leading us to Season 4. A season entitled Infection that, as of the time of writing the script, has not had any other cutscenes added to it. It has, however, introduced a new game mode known as Infection, which, as stated before, sees us battling against other Spartans whom Iritus has infected. Or at least I think that's what we are doing. Honestly, there's so little story development that I cannot even state that for a fact. Is Iritus infecting these Spartans, or are they just being kicked out of the simulation while he searches through it? Would surviving these outbreaks help purge him from the network like the Battle Royale mode somehow helped purge him from Spartan Din? If he does infect a Spartan in the simulation, could he control the Spartan's armor outside of it? Why does stabbing them with a sword infect them anyway if they are in a neural system he has already infected? Hopefully some of these questions will be answered as the season goes on, but given how little story has been given to us during the previous seasons, I am not holding my breath. It is worth noting that the game mode itself is very fun to play, so it steers clear of the first pitfall talked about earlier. That said, it dives straight down the second one, howling louder than Din did in the Season 3 cinematic.
See you at the bottom.
343 has tried to introduce new game modes based on the story of their seasonal narrative, and they just haven't made a lot of sense in my opinion. And if it's your opinion that you just don't care as long as the gameplay is fun, that's totally fair. I'm not gonna disagree with you about that. But if you do care about the story, it is really hard to overlook these plot holes once they've been set in motion. And because 343 has tied this game mode into their seasonal narrative, because video games just does not hold up as a reasonable answer. But honestly, I do think that this new take on a classic idea is a good one. I would have been really interested to see what it could have been if executed well. Like if 343 actually created additional lore to support and explain the finer details. And if there were more cutscenes per season. And if those seasons were 3 months long instead of 6 like they were supposed to be. And that leads me to the second part of this video's title. Do the pitfalls still exist if the story they are in is executed well? As an example, let's look at the original Halo trilogy and how Bungie wrote it. When Bungie writes a story, they will sometimes leave the specific details of new plot points vague. This may shock you, but they didn't have the entire story of Halo worked out when they made the first game.
Say what?
Rather, they wrote what they could without feeling like they had to explain every detail about it at the moment. Instead, it would be left open-ended and returned to in a later game if needed when the narrative was more fleshed out. This is a tactic that I am sure tabletop RPG masters are familiar with, and it is one that I've been using myself when writing my latest D&D campaigns. The reason to do this is that it allows a lot of flexibility and mystery in your writing, and Bungie does it very well. The major downside, though, is that if a story evolves in a direction that no longer makes sense with their previously vague details, you can inadvertently create plot holes. For example, when Halo Combat Evolved was being written, Forerunners were supposed to be ancient humans. That is why you get this line from 2 Betrayals.
Why would you hesitate to do what you've already done?
We need to go right now.
Last time you asked me, if it were my choice, would I do it? Having had considerable time to ponder your query, my answer has not changed.
However, midway through Halo 3's development, the plan was changed, and the Forerunners became a separate species. That left the task of explaining Guilty Spark's comment to 343 Industries when they took it over. And for their part, they did okay. But you can see how the change in narrative plan retroactively made this remark dubious. As an example of gameplay, Bungie's current IP, Destiny, is not immune from these pitfalls. While there are a couple of things we could pull from Destiny's gameplay to back this up, the one that comes to mind first is how players free the taken Techians during the Forsaken DLC of Destiny 2. Rather than going into detail on what it means to be taken or even what a Techian is, I am just going to elaborate on the 3 times you'd be asked to save them in-game. The first time is during a mission that would be later turned into a strike, in which you hunt down and defeat a taken Techian. Some dialogue at the beginning specifically asks you to save them instead of killing them. Now, with that, I would have expected there to be some mechanic that purged the taken energy from them and allowed us to save them. But there isn't. Instead, we just shoot and punch them a lot, just like we would any other enemy. And if we do enough damage to them, they suddenly find themselves restored and the taken energy dispelled. The other 2 cases are very similar, as the Techians show up as bosses in 2 separate raid encounters. And again, the fighting boils down to doing damage to them. Now, to be fair, there are additional mechanics that we must employ to lower their shields that could theoretically have been used to explain why they are no longer taken after we punch them enough. But all the mechanics are different, and none of them have been expressly stated to have anything to do with cleansing them. Now, again, the real answer for why it happens is because video games. And that is a perfectly satisfactory reason for most people. But in a game like Destiny, which is so rich in lore, where everything is written, and written well, to have an in-universe explanation, these specific occurrences just stand out like a sore thumb. The Forsaken DLC remains one of my personal favorites, with an incredible narrative that introduced a lot of lore to the Destiny story. It would almost be perfect. There are just these few minor criticisms it opens itself up to when it tries to make everything as awesome as possible. Tying every decision a character makes to in-universe reasons is, frankly, how stories should be written. And while video games have historically gotten a pass on this because their gameplay was more important to the average consumer than their campaigns, as they increasingly become known and loved for their rich stories, they will increasingly risk falling into the pitfalls of plot holes and bad mechanics. Whether done well or done poorly, it will always be a risk, and so it is up to the developers and writers to make every effort to avoid them, and up to the players and audience to show appreciation to them when they get it right, and a little grace when they get it wrong. But that is going to be it for us for today. Thank you all so much for hanging out with me. If you did like this video, please hit that like button to tell the algorithm to share it amongst all the people. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel to see more analysis on movies, video games, and television shows. For Fairly Critical, I've been your host, Jacob. You have been awesome, and I will see you in the next one.
John. I've waited so long to do that.
Liftoff of Mission 41D, the first flight of the orbital Discovery, and the shuttle has cleared the tower. Discovery's core computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.